much. Everybody hear me okay? So Johnny Rogers was giving me some positive encouragement at the beginning of the meeting. He says, I just thank God that they didn't ask me to talk about this topic, because guys, there's no good solutions to torn up pastures. And I'll go through tonight and we'll talk a little bit about it. Let me just start out and give you a little bit of my background. As Bart told you, and Bart, thank you for inviting me to come. It's a real honor to be here at the bull sale. As Bart said, I've been in Kentucky about 2 years. And previous to that, I was at Virginia Tech for 17 years. And before that, I was actually at the University of Kentucky. I got a doctorate there. I did my research in eastern Kentucky with reclaimed surface mine land with beef cattle grazing. We looked at 3 different stocking rates on that. Prior to that, I spent some time in the Navy, spent some time in Germany living and working on a German dairy farm, and I grew up in northeast Ohio on a crop and livestock farm. My family still has that farm there. Not a big one, about 100 acres in northeast Ohio. Used to be out in the country. Now it's kind of close to a mall. So times change, and they change pretty quick. If you have questions tonight as we go along, ask them, or comments, because I don't have all the solutions. And I'm going to kind of take you through thinking about figuring out what kind of shape your pastures are in, and then what are some potential solutions for pastures that are different degrees of damage. And we do have some different degrees of damage. So we're going to talk about assessing the pastures and then kind of making a plan from there depending on how bad that damage is. And I will say that sometimes when we don't assess pastures, we kind of have a knee-jerk reaction and we think that it's a lot worse than it is. And it is pretty bad around the feeding areas, but as you move out from those feeding areas, sometimes it's not quite as bad as we think. My contact information's on here. Oh, Alexander, I almost forgot. Could you pass those handouts out? I brought not enough handouts, but I brought about 36 handouts. So if you could take one per family or one per group that came, that would be ideal. In that way, you don't have to try to write something down during the presentation. Let's see. All right, so we'll move on from here. So my contact information's on the handout. You're always welcome to give me a call. I don't care if you're in Tennessee or North Carolina or Virginia. You're always welcome to call. My email's on there too, and you're welcome to email. Always encourage you to work through your extension agent. If you're in Kentucky, we've got a great set of county extension agents, and so we always encourage you to work with them as your first line of approach. But you're welcome to call me too. So we're seeing a lot of this as the hay feeding area at the research station in Princeton, and of course the damage increases the closer you get to the feeding area. Just makes sense, right? And the reason I'm telling you that is that as you move away from that hay feeding area, you go from really severe damage close to that hay feeding area into less severe damage. And sometimes that severe damage, we're always looking at that because that's where we're feeding hay at. We're dropping those bales off there and we say, well, my pastures have had it. But sometimes if you just step back a little bit and walk back a little bit, it's not quite as bad as you think. And one of the goals tonight is to think about how you quantify that disturbance. And I'm going to show you a little chart here, but in a way to kind of quantify it. And I know nobody's going to go home and make quadrats, right? But my motivation tonight is just to get you to think about how bad your damage really is. And I came across a paper from New Zealand that quantified pugging damage, that's damage from the hooves of the animals, using this kind of a method. And essentially they just made a quadrat and they kind of put it on the ground. They look at the amount of disturbance within this quadrat. For example, this quadrat maybe has about 20 or 25% disturbance in it. And then they looked at one other thing to kind of quantify this damage, and that's how deep those pugs are, how deep those hoof action is. Sometimes they're fairly shallow, a couple inches. Sometimes they're 6 or 8 inches deep, which is pretty severe. And they kind of take this information and put it into this table. It looks at the amount of disturbance here from 0 to 100%, and then how deep that disturbance is. And when you look at that, you can kind of say, well, I've got light damage or very light damage or moderate damage or severe damage. Now I know you're not going to go home and do the quadrat thing, but what I want you to do is just think about how bad your damage is. And once we kind of decide on that, then we can think about how we're going to approach that damage in that pasture. So this is kind of my flow chart that we're going to kind of go through tonight. We're going to assess the damage, assign it to a category of either, light, moderate, or severe, or very severe damage. And then we've got some different things that we'll think about doing to those pastures to kind of repair those pastures. And again, there's no perfect solution. So this is just an example of what I would call light to very light damage. So we've got some pugging in here and some disturbance, but it's fairly shallow. So this is very light damage. So that kind of falls into this, about 25% disturbance, about 1 to 2 inches in depth. So what do we do with this? If we have a light to very light damage, a lot of times we don't have to do much. We just have to give it a little bit of rest. And I'm going to go through, and always on the top of my list is soil fertility. We don't often pay enough attention to soil fertility in pastures, so I always want you to check that regardless of your level of damage and adjust it if you can. So that means lime and fertilizer is needed according to the soil test. In many cases, when we have just light and very light damage, all we need to do is just rest and allow that pasture to recover. And so not a lot of heroic action is required. We're going to have a little bit of reduction in yield, but just resting it and letting it recover, giving it a little bit more rest in the spring is going to really help. Another thing we can do is frost seed clover on that pasture. That's a good way to help get legumes back. They'll fill in those areas that were damaged a little bit in those light and very lightly damaged pastures. And then we just graze them lightly in the spring. So you don't have to take them out of your rotation. You just don't want to abuse them this spring. Give them a little bit of rest, maybe a couple weeks longer than you normally would between grazings, and just let them recover. The good Lord's going to help these pastures recover. Something's going to grow in there. And a lot of times we just need to give it a little bit of rest. So just give them a little bit of TLC this spring and we should be in pretty good shape. Just a couple notes on frost seeding. And it's getting a little bit late for frost seeding. Keys to success with frost seeding focuses on reducing the amount of residue on your pasture surface. So that means if you want to frost seed clover over a pasture, you want to graze pretty tight, tighter than you normally would, and that lets that seed get to the soil surface. And then we want adequate freeze and thaw cycles, and this is kind of where we're getting in this time of the year. We're probably not going to have a lot more freezing and thawing cycles, maybe a few, but really the ideal time to be overseeding pastures with frost seeding is in February, when we have that freezing and thawing that causes tiny cracks to form in that soil that incorporates the seed. So getting it on early is important. And then controlling competition after seeding. This is probably one of the biggest reasons that we have stand failures with frost seeding and other methods of overseeding pastures is we don't control competition from the sod once we get those seedlings germinated. So we get the seed on, we get the freezing and thawing, incorporates it in the soil, that seed germinates. Those little seedlings that are just coming out of the ground are very sensitive to shading stress, especially from the sod. So the best thing we can do when we frost seed a pasture is feed some hay on it. Put those animals back on it, let them walk that seed in with a little bit of animal impact. And let them eat that sod this time of the year as it's starting to green up and grow a little bit. And let those seedlings germinate and get some light. And everybody's always worried, well, I'm going to kill those seedlings. They're going to walk on those seedlings. They're going to nip those seedlings off. And they will do that to some of those seedlings. But if we don't control that competition, we risk losing all those seedlings to that shading effect of that sod. So we want to use high quality seed, of course, and we've got a great variety testing program in Kentucky. I'd encourage you to use it. We have a publication called the Long-Term Variety Summary. It takes data over a 10 or 12 year period and kind of summarizes it on red clover varieties, especially, and lets you know what the best red clover variety is. Probably one of the best varieties is one that was bred at Kentucky called Kenland. It's fairly inexpensive seed. You can buy it certified. It was a public variety, and it's a good, solid variety with good performance over many, many years. Use the correct seeding rate. And I'm going to talk about drill calibration in a little bit, but when we're overseeding pastures, it's important we get the right seeding rate on too. A lot of times we'll start out and we'll have the seeder open a little bit too far, and we'll get halfway across and run out of seed. So that's an expensive mistake to make, so make sure you get the seeder set right and you're getting the right seeding rate on, and get even seed distribution. How many of you have ever driven a four-wheeler across a pasture spreading seed? You know, it's easy to stand up here and say, get even seed distribution, right? It's not quite as easy when you're sitting on that four-wheeler to do that. And one of the things that we did this year was we actually bought a little GPS unit for the four-wheeler. And it has made overseeding pastures much easier than I have ever anticipated. And you can start to buy these little units. I'm going the wrong way here. You can start to buy these little units used now if you look on the internet, and they can actually be pretty cost effective. But they really let you see where you've been in that pasture. So this summer I'm going to have an intern simulate overseeding pastures with and without a GPS unit. We're going to see where he misses and where he overlaps and how much extra seed or misses that we have in the pasture. It also lets you see your speed. A lot of four-wheelers don't have speed on it, and we think we're going 6 miles an hour. We may be going 9 miles an hour too in the pasture. So this is just a good solid recommendation for overseeding. 6 to 8 pounds of red clover, medium red clover, 1 to 2 pounds of a ladino clover. That's a large white clover. White clover comes in 3 types. It comes as a Dutch white. We generally don't recommend using that. It tends to be smaller and lower producing. And then we have a medium type or a grazing type, like Durano or Copu 2. And those are intermediate in height. And then we have large white clover, which we call ladino clover. That produces about 3 to 5 times as much dry matter as a Dutch white clover. So we generally recommended using those ladino clovers. Over time, what will happen if you use a ladino clover is you'll get some intercrossing between the naturally occurring Dutch white clover in the pastures and the ladino clover, and you'll get some of your own intermediate type ecotypes of clover in that pasture. And then you can always throw in 10 to 15 pounds of annual Lespedeza. This is kind of a forgotten legume. You know, 60 years ago, we used a lot of annual Lespedeza in pastures in this part of the country before we had access to lime and fertilizer like we do now. Annual Lespedeza tends to do a little bit better at lower fertility. So if you've got some pastures that are kind of borderline for fertility, or you're renting some ground where you can't justify making the investment in lime and fertilizer because you're on a year-to-year lease, throwing a little bit of annual Lespedeza in may be a good choice. It's a warm season annual legume, so it's going to produce some dry matter during the summer months. Generally speaking, it's a little bit lower producing than our improved clovers. And again, we had mentioned frost seeding, but really we're getting into the time of the year that you probably would be more successful with a no-till seeding, just because we're not having those freezing and thawing cycles. So we want to get that seed in contact with the soil, and that's what a no-till drill does well. We'll talk a little bit more about no-till drills in a minute. All right, so that was kind of light damage. So we adjust soil fertility, we rest those pastures, and we frost seed a little clover on if we need clover in that stand. Now we're getting into moderate damage. So moderate damage is, going to be anywhere from around, 40 to 60% disturbance and fairly deep pugging. So in this particular picture here, we've got probably 25, about, somewhere in that 50% range in terms of soil disturbance. And the pugging's probably 3 inches deep or so. And that puts us in this range here, if you look at this chart, in this moderate damage range. And once we quantify that damage, we can kind of make a plan on what to do in terms of rehabilitating this pasture. So if we look at moderate damage, again, we start out with soil fertility, test and adjust soil fertility as needed. And then we can overseed with a grass legume mixture this spring. And a good recommendation would be 15 to 25 pounds of tall fescue. So if we've got that moderate damage, about half of the sod disturbed, you know, we can go in there and we can actually thicken it up with a tall fescue and maybe a little orchard grass, and then a little bit of clover would be good to include in that mixture too. 6 to 8 pounds of red clover and a pound or two of ladino clover. And ideally we would no-till that in if possible. And the reason we want to no-till it in is that we want to keep intact what plants we have left in that pasture. So if we go in there and start doing a bunch of tillage, we can actually further damage that sod in those remaining plants. If we have to do tillage, make sure it's light tillage. You want to do it as light as possible to avoid further damage to that sod. And then broadcast that seed on if you're doing tillage, and pack it in so you get good soil to seed contact. Yep. So the soil temperatures for cool season grasses, we can do that anytime now. So we want the soil temperatures to be probably in that, you know, mid 50s to 60 range, somewhere in there. I think I would go ahead and do it when it's dry. So if you get a window to do it, I think I'd go ahead and do it. Generally, we start recommending overseeding pastures with cool season grasses about mid-March or so. So the question is if we broadcast the seed and run a cultipacker over it, I think that could certainly help get some disturbance. What I like to see sometimes, if you're broadcasting that seed, to put a pasture harrow behind it and just drag a little bit of dirt up with that pasture harrow as you're broadcasting that seed. And then if you want to come back and cultipacker, that'll help even more. But somehow you got to get that seed in contact with the soil. I think cultipacking will certainly help. A light harrowing with like a pasture drag may help more just by disturbing a little bit of soil to get it in contact with. And you know, we talk about these things like they're a foolproof plan, but you know, establishing forages is far from a foolproof plan, right? So we can do everything just right, and if the good Lord doesn't participate with a little bit of rain at the right time, you know, we have a failure in many cases. So rain makes an agronomist look pretty smart. So, all right, let's just talk a little bit about no-till drills and a couple tips for successfully using no-till drills in pasture renovation. And they do take a little bit more effort than just putting a little seeder on a four-wheel and driving across the pasture. But generally speaking, you're putting that seed in contact with the soil, and that's gonna help get a better stand, a more consistent stand in many cases. And there are mistakes we can make with no-till drills that we'll talk about in a minute. This can be successful in the spring or the fall. So when we think about success, again, like frost seeding, we want to get rid of the residue, as much of the residue on the soil surface as we can, so that we do get good contact. If we have too much residue and we try to no-till into that residue, a lot of times we'll cause what's called hairpinning. That's where the residue kind of gets pushed down into that slit, and that seed falls in that little basket of residue, and it doesn't have good contact with the soil, and we don't get good consistent stands. So make sure and graze that pasture hard if you haven't done that already, and to reduce that residue. Calibrate the drill prior to seeding. You know, people often skip this step, and this is kind of a bad step to skip in many cases. There's probably people sitting in this room, I won't ask you to raise your hands, that have no-tilled forages into pastures and ran out halfway across the pasture because they failed to calibrate the drill. And as drills get older and things wear, you know, the seeding charts on the drill are not as exact as they once were. We came up, this is kind of hard to read this, but it's in, why don't you pass those out, Alexander? It's in this calendar that we have. It's a really, really simple method. I've done drill calibrations for years, and we kind of came up with this method last year, some students and I. And this is a really easy method to calibrate a drill with because it requires only one math problem. All right? So before we want you to convert acres to feet and so on. And all you have to do with this method is know your row spacing on the drill and know how much seed you want to put out. Doesn't matter what seed you're seeding, you just have to know how many pounds of seed you want to put out per acre. And it goes through this procedure, and then in this table it tells you how many grams of seed you need to catch per disc opener. Pretty simple method. We've demonstrated this at our tall fescue, novel endophyte tall fescue renovation school, and people really pick up on it pretty quick. So take a look at that. It's in this calendar, and I'll just mention this calendar. This is our first ever grazing calendar for Kentucky. So it's a great calendar. It's got great pictures every month, and a wealth of information. Each month has got tips on grazing management, and then down in the corner we've got a fencing tip in here too. So, and we brought about 35 of those too. If you don't get one and would like one, just give me an email and we'll be happy to send you one. So make sure you calibrate your drill. And anybody get progressive forage grower? We got a couple of people in here, but if you get that, Jessica Buckman, she was my summer student, wrote a nice article on this drill calibration method, and it just got published in Progressive Forage Grower. And also one other resource for calibrating a drill is this video on this method. We've got a nice video. If you just search UKY Master Grazer, there's a nice video on there that goes through all the steps in calibrating a grain drill. It's about 10 minutes. All right, so you calibrated your drill. Now the next critical thing is to check and recheck your seeding depth. Don't take somebody's word for it. If you're borrowing a drill from the conservation district, don't take their word that the seeding depth is set right. One mistake that's commonly made with drills is we put the seed too deep. Our small seeded forages need to go about 1/2 inch deep. If we go deeper than 1/2 inch, chances of them coming up and giving us a uniform stand are pretty small. So check and recheck your seeding depth. A good general rule is if you can't see a little bit of seed on the top along the drill slit, you're probably going a little bit too deep. These So the question is whether we should mix the seeds together. I generally will either mix them together or I'll put grasses that tend to be lighter in the large box on the drill and the legumes, mixture of red and white clover in a small box on the front. And but generally both of them need to be in contact with the soil. So I don't think you should just dribble grasses on top of the soil. They really need to be down in that slit too, about 1/2 inch deep. So we're just checking and rechecking our seeding depth here. And then again, like frost seeding, we want to control competition after we no-till seed. So if we get everything right and then we don't control competition, we have a real risk of not getting a good stand with a no-till drill also. So that's competition from that sod. So the best thing we can do is graze it. Put animals on it and graze it. So generally speaking, they are going to provide competition, but not until those seedlings have had time to come up because they're warm season species. So they're going to be more in the summer months. They're going to provide competition during the summer months. And we have a lot of what people call Bermuda grass now, but it may not be Bermuda grass. We've got a bad summer weed in our pastures called nimblewill. And that nimblewill will look very similar to Bermuda grass, except animals will not eat it. And so if you have something that they're not eating, grab a sample of it and take it to your extension agent, because it may be nimblewill, and that's a very difficult weed to control in pastures. Buttercup, probably. A huge what? Right. So So buttercup commonly comes up in pastures that have been grazed a little bit tighter than they should have been, and that opens the sod up and lets them come up. Probably one of the best things we can do for buttercups is change the way we're grazing our pastures a little bit to leave a little bit more residual. And I know that's hard to do sometimes. We can kill buttercups in other weeds. We've got some really effective herbicides out there now. We've got always had 2,4-D and dicamba, but now we've got Grazon and Chaparral and some other very potent herbicides for pastures. The problem with those herbicides is that if we base our weed control program just on those herbicides, you know, what do we have? We spray Grazon and we kill all of our weeds. What do we have when we kill those weeds? We got a hole in our pasture, right? What grows in a hole? Another weed. So when we think about weed control in pastures, we really need to be thinking about it from an integrated approach. And that's all those things that we've been talking about. The type of forage species we choose, how close we're grazing our pastures, how frequently we're grazing our pastures, our soil fertility, and all those play an important role in a weed control program in pastures. You'll lose your mind if you're basing your program solely on herbicides. Boy, it went from a hard presentation to an even harder one. So there's no good solution for nimble in pastures at this point. Ray Smith in Kentucky is doing some work, and Alex is actually helping him with that work, looking at some different grazing management strategies for trying to control it, but nothing has worked out real well yet. At some point, when you're infested with nimble and it gets to a certain percentage in your pasture, you're just going to have to bite the bullet and renovate that pasture, most likely. There's not a good solution. Greg Brand has done some grazing, calls it boom or bust grazing on his pastures, and he thinks it helps a little bit with nimble. You know, I'm not sure it's a permanent solution.
By working the soil up, does that kill that nimble weed? By working it up and starting over?
So the question is by working it up, it could, you know, if you do enough tillage, it could potentially kill it, but you're probably better off to spray it with glyphosate and just no-till back into it. Not a big proponent of working pastures up because usually they're fields that should not be worked up in most cases. So, yeah, so no good solutions on that either, Gordon. You're not going to ask me back again because I can't give you any good solutions to these hard questions. All right, I just want to think with these moderately damaged pastures, I mean, you can think a little bit outside the box. So we talked about coming back in and interseeding cool season grasses into these moderately damaged pastures, right? And that can work, but cool season grasses can really struggle in the spring, right? Because of competition from summer annual weeds like spiny amaranth and all these other summer annuals. So maybe thinking about it from a little bit different approach may work in some of these moderately damaged pastures, and that's overseeding them with a mixture of crabgrass and red clover. I'll probably get thrown out of the county for mentioning crabgrass, but there are some improved crabgrass varieties out there, and they can provide some good summer forage. David Fisk, who just passed away in Virginia, was our superintendent at the Shenandoah Valley Research Station. He did an interesting demonstration one spring where he went into these hay feeding areas this time of year, cleaned them up, leveled them out, and then he either took half of them and he overseeded them with the standard recommendation of fescue and clover and so forth, and the other half he overseeded with crabgrass. And the ones that he overseeded with crabgrass had many fewer weeds on them because that crabgrass got up, formed a canopy, and shaded those weeds out versus the cool season grasses, which kind of get going a little bit, and then it starts to get hot as we get into June. And their growth really slows down. They don't have a good chance to really get well established. So crabgrass may be an option. We can seed this time of year. We've just put out several demos this week on farms in western Kentucky. We made a mixture of crabgrass, red clover, and annual lespedeza. A 1-to-1 mixture is what we use: 5 pounds of crabgrass, 5 pounds of red clover, and 5 pounds of annual lespedeza. Broadcast them onto these moderately disturbed areas. And we turn the animals back in. And we're just kind of letting them walk that crabgrass and that clover into that pasture. And then we're going to see how it performs this summer. The clover should germinate now. The annual Lespedeza will germinate as it gets a little bit warmer, and the crabgrass will germinate as it gets a little bit warmer. And then what do we do with this? We can use crabgrass as hay, but it's probably best utilized by grazing it. And then we can come back in the fall and interseed a cool season grass in the fall. So when we seed a cool season grass in the fall, and I prefer fall, late summer, and fall seedings, we avoid all those problems with summer annual weeds, goosegrass and crabgrass and spiny amaranth and red root pigweed, and all those summer annual grasses in forbs we can avoid with a late summer or fall seeding. So this is just a little bit about crabgrass, well adapted to what we call the Mid-South. It's truly a warm season annual grass, so it has to come back from seed every year, but its advantage is it's a really good reseeder. So once you plant it, you should get enough volunteer seed for it to come back from the following year, so you don't have to plant it every year. Really, it needs to be, if you're growing it in a pure stand, double cropped with a winter annual like annual ryegrass or a small grain and annual ryegrass, or something that's going to grow during the off season from, say, September until it germinates again in April. Good yield potential, but where it really excels is forage quality. There's been a lot of work at the Noble Foundation that shows that good quality crabgrass can produce average daily gains unsupplemented in the range of 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds a day. So the quality is there. No prussic acid like we would have with a sorghum Sudan grass or forage sorghum or Johnson grass. This is some work we did in Southside Virginia, not far from Johnny and Ronnie Holman, with Red River Crabgrass, and this was the first harvest 60 days after seeding. Pretty amazing growth. These are 30-inch flags, and that crabgrass is pushing every bit of 2 feet tall. So the improved crabgrasses, and there's 4 or 5 available in the market now, have been selected for more upright growth, higher dry matter production, and longer leaves. So it's a little bit different than what we have in terms of ecotypes of common crabgrass on our farms, just more productive. This is a nitrogen response of crabgrass to nitrogen. So we've got crabgrass yield here, nitrogen rate, increasing rate on the bottom, up to 400 pounds. Maximum dry matter production of 305 pounds of nitrogen. Don't ever put 305 pounds of nitrogen on crabgrass. You want to be down here on the straight part of the curve at about 100 pounds, applied as split applications, okay? So this was a research project, right? We wanted to see where it was going to kind of level out at. But down here in this range of 100, maybe 120 pounds, applied as 2 or 3 applications. Yeah, so you would apply a little bit after it germinates and starts to grow. As it starts to tiller, you want to apply a little bit, and then after each grazing or cutting, you could apply a little bit more to stimulate growth during the summer months. In our warm season grasses, whether they're Johnson grass or crabgrass or sorghum Sudan grass or a pearl millet, they're all going to respond to nitrogen. So we need to make that commitment if we're going to use a summer annual grass to put a little bit of fertility on it. It increases not only the biomass production, but also the crude protein in those warm season grasses. All right, so now we're down to our last category. That's when we just don't have a lot left, right? Severe damage. And this is the case around many hay feeding areas now. So we need to kind of figure out what to do with this very severe damage area. So again, soil fertility, check it, make sure it's right. We're going to have to reestablish a cool season forage base. But the big question comes in, do we try to do it now or do we wait till the fall? That's really the question I think that we need to think about. A lot of times we can try it now, but chances of being successful, especially if we wait until things get dried out and we get a little bit late in our seeding of the cool season grasses and we gets pushed back a little bit, chances of those seedlings getting big enough to really make it through this first summer, especially if we have any kind of pressure on them from animals, is going to be pretty slim. So many cases, I think it may be better to wait till late summer. So that means we've got from now until late summer before we reestablish those pastures. And what do we do in the meantime? I think a good option may be using a summer annual. Could be crabgrass, but it could also be a more traditional summer annual like a sorghum Sudan grass or a Sudan grass or a pearl millet would be a good choice in some of these areas. And we're going to need some tillage in these areas because they're going to be deeply disturbed. We could drill or broadcast that summer annual on. And if we go with the summer annual, one of my favorites that gets out of the ground really quick is a good BMR sorghum Sudan grass. It gets up, it grows quickly, and because it gets out of the ground quickly, it's going to shade out a lot of the weed competition. And we can harvest it this summer, or we can graze it if we need emergency hay. Summer annuals make a good choice also. A little bit difficult to cure, but you can make hay and haylage out of summer annuals. I think Gordon, did I see some sorghum Sudan grass haylage? Do you guys make baleage here? Okay, good. A non-selective herbicide again in the fall. So we go through the summer, we graze it or harvest it, and we come back in the fall with a non-selective herbicide, glyphosate, and then come in with a perennial no-till, a no-till and a perennial cool season mix, whatever you decide to go with. Novel endophyte tall fescue would be ideal, maybe with a little clover and orchard grass. So this following spring, so I just wanted to mention real quick that when we establish a cool season sod, we always think about it as being established as soon as it comes out of the ground, but really it's about 18 months before it's really fully established, so about a year and a half before it's got a really strong, healthy root system down. One of the mistakes we make is that we graze it too hard that first year, and that really can hurt a cool season sod that's trying to establish. So I'm not telling you don't utilize it for hay or grazing that first year, but be gentle with it. So don't camp the animals out, let them get in there, let them take the top off and move them out. Leave some stubble on it going into summer. That stubble is going to help conserve soil moisture, and it's going to moderate the temperature at the crown of that grass plant and help that grass plant get through that first summer. Don't cut it too close. One of the worst things that's ever happened to our orchard grass stands has been the invention of the disc mower, I'm afraid. Because we can cut so close to the soil surface with the disc mower if we don't have it adjusted right. And really, for an orchard grass stand to persist, and a tall fescue stand too in a hayfield, we need to be up around 3 to 4 inches stubble height. If we're cutting down at that 1 to 2 inch range, which is commonly done, we can really damage a hayfield as we go into a cool season hayfield as we go into summer. So make sure and tilt that disc mower up and leave a good 3 to 4 inches of stubble there. All right, I just want to tell you about a couple of summer annual demonstrations that we did. We did 6 of these around Western Kentucky last year, and it was a lot of fun. I had 2 great interns, Hunter Adams and Jessica Buckman. Jessica wrote, and Hunter wrote that article on calibrating the drill. Lots of help on the farms. And we went out and we seeded several different summer annuals on farms in 6 different places in Western Kentucky. And then we had field days at these farms just to get people thinking about incorporating summer annuals into a pasture renovation sequence. So summer annuals should never be the basis of a forage program. They should be used for an emergency feed as a renovation crop to move back into a well-adapted cool season pasture. So we had these 6 locations here. We had 4 treatments that we had a BMR sorghum Sudan grass, AS9302 from Advanta Seed. We had a Wonder Leaf Pearl Millet. We had a forage soybean. Large lad, and then we had a mixture of the 3. And we put these out on farms, and we kind of collected some data. And one thing that we found universally across farms is that we did not put any herbicide on after initial burn down. And the soybeans really struggled under this kind of a management. The summer annual grasses kind of got up, and they just could not get off to a good start. And interestingly enough, some volunteer crabgrass filled in on many of those farms with those soybeans. And And that's just the good Lord telling you that maybe you should be thinking a little bit harder about crabgrass in your forage program. And then on one farm, we actually seeded a mixture of improved crabgrass and annual espadiza, which can make a nice mixture. And that was some good grazing for those cattle during the summer months. Seeding depth matters. This was a demo, one of the demos that an extension agent put out for us. So this was one of the first passes of the pearl millet, and he decided it wasn't going deep enough, so he lowered the drill. And these are the subsequent passes on either side. So pearl millet, especially of the summer annuals, is pretty sensitive to seeding depth, so it's important that we get it about a ½ an inch deep and no deeper. The one thing probably my favorite species this summer was the Sudan grass, because it just got out of the ground fast. It got out, it formed a canopy, and where it formed a canopy, we just had a lot less weed pressure in those pastures. And I'd highly recommend a BMR. That's a brown midrib variety if you're considering a summer annual. They tend to be about 5% more digestible, which is going to translate into better average daily gain on calves in these systems. This was kind of a neat picture. This was our mixture where we had a little bit of millet and a little bit of sorghum Sudan and forage soybean versus just a straight stand of Sudan grass. Just a tremendous difference in the amount of weed pressure we had in those two stands because that Sudan grass got out of the ground so quickly and formed that canopy to shade those weeds out. And then we sampled our plots. We looked at both forage quality and yield, and this was our yield at the first harvest, our first grazing. We ranged between 2,000 pounds on our soybeans up to our pearl millet and Sudan grass, which was about 5,000 pounds of dry matter at that first harvest. So it can be a very productive part of a grazing or haying system. All right, I'm done. Is there any questions? Crabgrass is truly an annual, and it kind of acts like a perennial through reseeding. So if I plant it this year, I prepare a seed bed, or I've got a disturbed area, I broadcast it on, I get a good stand of crabgrass. I want to let it go to seed one time during the season. I say want to let it, but it's going to go to seed whether you want to let it or not. And that seed's going to shatter, it's going to overwinter, and then come up next spring. To stimulate the stand in the spring, a little bit of light tillage, a pasture drag, or some kind of real light soil disturbance will get that volunteer seed in contact with the soil, and you'll get a nice crabgrass stand that following year.
Look at that picture on the top right. Got me thinking. Are you seeing sugarcane aphids in your sorghum?
We had some. They were less of a problem in our sorghum Sudan than our forage sorghum variety trial. We're starting to see, and we're kind of far north, so they seem like they're less of a problem than they would be in Texas, where they're kind of starting at and moving northward. But they can certainly stun a plant. And we're doing ratings now looking at sugar cane aphid tolerance in our forage sorghum varieties at harvest. That's one advantage of using the millet, is it's less susceptible to the sugarcane aphid damage. Did you guys see? You guys have some forage sorghum too, right? Have you seen aphids in it? Bad or? You did spray? How'd you end up spraying? A high boy? So you're using a dwarf? Yeah. Good. So yeah, so that's certainly an option is to spray to control those, and you may need to do that. We're using a BMR forage sorghum. So yeah, that's like the all-star forage sorghum. It doesn't get much better than that. That's a good solid variety. Forage sorghum may have a place in systems for silage in this part of the state, especially on soils that are kind of marginal for corn silage. That's where their fit really is. In a good year on a good soil, you know, corn silage is going to out yield it every time. But on these marginal soils, it can do pretty well. The other advantage is that it's a lot cheaper to plant than corn. So, is there any other questions? Yes, sir. So the question is about bull lots, and they're a chronic problem, as Gordon knows well, in terms of maintaining something on those bull lots. And probably the most durable grass, I would say, would be a Bermuda grass if you can get it to grow here. But it's still not perfect. I mean, you put enough pressure on Bermuda grass, you can even kill that eventually. And there are some improved seeded Bermuda grasses that you could establish that have better cold tolerance. And if you're interested in one of those, get with me and we can talk about varieties. The other option in those kind of areas is that we just do a kind of a rotation of crabgrass and a winter annual like annual ryegrass or a small grain or something like that to kind of just hold the world together as best as we can. Gordon, did you have a question? Yeah, so of the small grain options, the option to plant in the spring would be a spring oat. It's going to have the highest productivity. It's going to give you 1 to 2 tons of dry matter, maybe a little bit more in a good year if you get them in on time. And so that's now. I mean, they need to go in now if you're going to try spring oats. A lot of times, I think you may be better off to forego the spring oat and just do a timely seeding of a summer annual. Get it in and get it prepared, get the ground prepared and get it in and ground on time and just get a better stand of the summer annual. Sometimes I think when we try a spring oat, it pushes our summer annual planting back too far and we get kind of a bad summer annual stand because we wait too long to seed it. Mm-hmm.
And then you have to, it doesn't put as much stress on you. You're not wanting to permanently seed that back, but maybe get 2 cuttings off. Most everybody that we've sort of talked to, they're very short on fall, seedings of any kind of wheat or anything. So there's not a lot of wheat out there.
Right.
Not a lot of things in the spring to wrap. So you get this one cutting, and then we're coming back with some permanent establishment of August, September seedings of normal traditional grasses,
right,
clovers and everything, and then we feel like maybe that if we can get those good stands of spring oats, there's more tonnage, but that's what we've been trying to consider.
Yeah, and that can certainly work. So you're foregoing the summer annual in that system and kind of just leaving it fallow from when you cut those spring oat until the fall or late summer.
Probably, but if you have a really good, good stand and good yield on the spring oats, it's going to be possibly May,
So June, July, and then
get your land ready for
August seeding. Yeah, that can work. Any other questions? Do you like it or hate it? So I know which way to go with this question. If you're a small grain farmer, then you hate annual ryegrass, right? So, but annual ryegrass is probably one of my favorite annuals. It's just a tremendous grass. Do a fall seeding with it. You can do a spring seeding with an Italian ryegrass if you have to in an emergency situation, but a lot of times you don't get quite the productivity out of it that you think you should because it doesn't have long enough to grow before it gets hot. And annual ryegrass really kind of shuts down as we get into June and is not real productive after that. But it can be a great fall seeded crop, produce a tremendous amount of forage, and the animal performance is very high off of annual ryegrass. Can be made as hay, although it can be hard to get cured as hay because it's so lush, but as baleage, or if you're chopping it to put in a silo, you can do that, or you can graze it ideally. We had a dairy close to my research station in Virginia. In 1 year, they lost almost all of their alfalfa stands. They had a hot, wet summer, and when they cut the alfalfa, it's real susceptible to waterlogging damage. They had a lot of water after that cutting, and most of their stands died. So they came back with annual ryegrass in the fall as an emergency forage crop. They use it in their system now as a one-cut silage crop. So they come in the spring, they let it get up, they mow it, wilt it, and put it in the silo, and then come back with the corn silage in those fields. And that's worked real well for them in that type of a rotation. Although you can get multiple cuttings off of annual ryegrass, so you can get 2 or 3 cuttings in the spring if you get in there early and on time and take that first cutting timely. That's one of the advantages of annual ryegrass over a small grain, is that small grains, once you cut them one time, you move that growing point and you're done. Annual ryegrass will keep regrowing until heat limits that regrowth. Yeah, it does work well because they complement each other in a kind of in a growing period. The crabgrass will be productive from say May until late August, and the annual ryegrass would be productive from late August until May sometime. That's right. And we are behind on hay this year, so making some good quality hay, and I'm going to get off here in 1 second, Bart, but let me just tell you that a lot of the hay that we put up last year in this part of the country was some pretty bad quality hay, and we're seeing the effects of that now. This next month is going to be pretty bad. We had animals that have been struggling all winter on really low quality hay, and they're starting to really go backwards, and we're seeing some animals die with full bellies, so they just can't digest it. They can't move it fast enough through their system. So I would encourage everybody here to, if you've got some hay that you think that's pretty low quality, get it tested in the fall before you start to feed it, just so you know that you're going to need to supplement that hay to get those animals through the winter with some decent condition on them. All right, I'm done, Bart. I'll be around all evening if you have any more questions.